So when we look at abnormality in Scripture, it is important to remember a few things. And first and foremost, the fact that when God created the world and created human beings, he did not create us with psychopathology. It was not until sin entered the world that psychopathology entered the world. So when we see God's initial design for us as human beings, it is to love him and to love others in paradise, in close relationship with him, apart from sin, completely in his presence. And of course, now that we're in a fallen world, our purpose hasn't necessarily changed. It is still to love him and to love other people, but it looks different now. We are born sinful. We live in a fallen world. So if we're looking at Scripture, I would say anything apart from his initial design would technically be considered abnormal, because God is not arbitrary. He created the world to be lived in a specific way, and he gives outlines for that in Scripture, both mentally and physically, like with our deeds and our actions. So I would say that anything apart from God's design would be technically abnormal. Taking a really easy example, in American culture, we're very individualistic. So if you take that too far to where you live your life and you really don't think that you need other people or that you need God in any form, I would say that would be technically abnormal, because God created us in his image, and part of that is that he created us with a need for a relationship, and he very much so created us with a need for him. So looking at Scripture, you can see how even things that are kind of deemed normal by cultural standards would technically be abnormal. Sin is abnormal, and it can contribute to psychopathology. If you just look at generational sin, like the cycle of abuse or even dependence on alcohol, how that can affect children and offspring just going down the line. So absolutely we can see, that's kind of a broad overview of abnormality in Scripture, but I would say anything outside of his initial design for us would be abnormal. And sin can contribute as well to mental disorders, I would say. I don't think that, if you have a mental disorder, it's due solely to sin, but I do think there is a contributing factor as well, because we live in a fallen world, and God did not create us with psychopathology. So, the DSM-5 2013, though, if we're looking at a secular view of psychopathology, the DSM-5 2013 defines mental disorder. I'm going to read this. As a mental disorder, a mental disorder is a syndrome characterized by clinically significant disturbances in an individual's cognition, emotion regulation, or behavior that reflects a dysfunction in the psychological, biological, or developmental process underlying mental functioning. That is more of the secular view of abnormality. Psychopathology often changes with culture. It is certainly informed by culture, and I think that has both pros and cons for sure. Malero 2018 talked about this in both a positive and negative light, how we are able to be more informed about psychopathology, traumatic stress responses and PTSD even, how our culture now can help us and help inform us on psychopathology, what might be normal, different cultural differences. What might be deemed abnormal here might be normal somewhere else, and those are important distinctions as well. But we can also see different ways that psychopathology changes with culture, what culture would deem moral or immoral, etc. If we look at homosexuality or transgenderism, several years ago that was in the DSM-5 and now it's not. So you can see how that kind of changes due to society or cultural preferences for certain things. And interestingly, the DSM-5 very much talked about, it's more so about individual functioning within a societal setting. So that would be kind of more of a secular view of psychopathology, based in research for sure. And that's why I think if I were to define psychopathology, I would of course lean into what Scripture says first and foremost. However, I am someone who ascribes to the Allies model, so I don't think Scripture and science just are incompatible. I think I ascribe to what Entwistle 2015 talks about in his book, that all truth is God's truth. So we can use Scripture to inform science, we can use science to inform Scripture, or inform our opinion on Scripture. So it's not necessarily separate. I think it's important to do research, to study research, to understand psychopathology from, quote unquote secular point of view in order to, better be able to diagnose. However, we do need to allow scripture to inform our view of it as well. Not necessarily, we don't need to allow culture or society or something outside of scripture to inform what we deem as moral, of course. And I think a lot of the time that can end up informing psychopathology in secular settings. And so I think it's important that we allow science and scripture to inform one another when it comes to not only psychopathology but all things in counseling. So